Welcome to a special two-part series on the Divorce and Money podcast. Today's episode is a little bit different. I recently presented at a private forum for medical professionals, and I wanted to share this content with you. With you that probably spent a decade in medical training, you built a thriving practice, you have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into your professional reputation and patient relationships. And in divorce, all of that can become a negotiating chip. As you know, I am Gabriela Martinelli, and for over 21 years, I have helped physicians protect what they have built when their marriages end. Today, I'm going to share with you the financial blind spots that could cost you your practice and how to prevent them. Marriage is about love. Divorce is about money. Without the right guidance, critical mistakes can have lasting financial consequences. That is where I come in. My name is Gabriela Martinelli, founder at Ever After Wealth. As a certified divorce financial analyst, I provide my clients financial clarity, strategic divorce planning, and long-term stability. On this podcast, I am sharing what you need to know about getting through a divorce, protecting your legacy, growing your wealth and assets post-divorce, and figuring it out what you really want in this next stage of life. Let's get started.
What makes medical professionals particularly exposed in divorce?
Well, medical professionals face a unique triple threat. That's what I like to call it in divorce, and that most other business owners actually do not experience. So first, you have the high invisible income, right? The tax returns for doctors clearly show the earning capacity, which immediately puts you in a different bracket for support calculations, right? And again, let's be honest, if you say, I'm a doctor, I own my practice, that generates a different reaction from people in general. So there is a blind spot because the courts often assume that your income is stable and they will continue indefinitely. But they do not take into account the reality that the physician's income depends on their physical and mental capacity to practice. For example, there's malpractice insurance cost, or there's a burnout that affects every single physician, right? The second vulnerability that I see is that their professional reputation is both invaluable and vulnerable. You cannot protect your patient's relationship the way a business owner can protect a client list, right? With a potentially a non-compete. If your divorce becomes contentious or is public, it can damage your referral networks. Those networks that actually probably took decades to build. I have seen divorces, for example, where one spouse threatened to air grievances publicly. And that threat alone can actually become a leverage when you're trying to negotiate how you divide your assets in your practice. And third, I will say the practice is both an asset and the livelihood for the doctor or the physician. That creates a devastating catch-22. If the practice, for example, on its own is valued way too high in a divorce, you may be forced to buy out your spouse's interest potentially, right? And is an asset that you cannot sell without destroying your income. So you sell your practice, your income goes away. And if you keep your practice, you have to find a way to potentially buy out your spouse because they're going to have some interest within that practice. And if it is too low, you're not really protecting what you built and all the money and the time that you spend in building this practice. So for me, what is something that I actually think that physicians do not realize until it's too late is that many of them built their practices during the marriage. That means the spouse may have a legitimate claim to the increased value of that practice, even when they have no work in that practice. Some states, for example, allow for reimbursement of separate property contributions within a medical practice, but you have to document and prove those contributions. If you don't have the proof, you can't really take that into consideration. And most physicians, I mean, have no idea what the financial records they need are or have kept any kind of good record of their financial contributions to this practice, right?
So when it comes to medical professionals, there's definitely some intricacies there that you covered. So how does a private practice differ from a traditional business asset?
That is a great question because there's the biggest one is the goodwill problem, right? So this is where I actually see the thousands and even the $1 million mistake happen. A traditional business, for example, has tangible assets. And you can point to them, right? You can see them. You have inventory, you have equipment, you have real estate, you have intellectual property that exists independent of the owner, right? In a medical practice, the most valuable part of the practice is often the personal goodwill, right? Is the reputation of the physician, is the relationship with the patients, the relationship with the referring physicians, right? Their skill and their expertise. And the critical question here that determines everything is whether that goodwill is a community asset, a marital asset, depending on your jurisdiction, whether it's subject to division or is personal and you can actually consider it separate property. And the problem is that different states answer the questions differently. And sometimes within the same state, different experts can value the same practice with wildly different conclusions. For example, I actually work with a orthopedic surgeon whose practice was valued at 2.8 million by his spouse's experts. However, his experts working with me actually value it at 400,000. So if you think about it, that is a 2.4 million difference in what would be owed in a potential buyout from their spouse. Now, that range exists because they made different assumptions about whether the reputation and his capacity, right, the fact that he is the practitioner, can be transferred to another physician or not. And this is where the battle of the business valuators really come into place because they use different ways to value this business. And they're guided sometimes by their client's spouse, that they consider it separate, they consider it as not separate. So that is a very, very important distinction when it comes to medical practices from another business. And basically is the enterprise versus the personal goodwill distinctions. So what you need to understand is the enterprise goodwill is the value that will remain if you sold the practice tomorrow, right? That has to do with the location or your systems or your staff if they stay within the practice, and maybe your patients and patients' records if they're transferable depending on your practice. Medical practices sometimes own real estate. Well, that's part of the value of the enterprise as a medical practice. Then you have the personal goodwill. That is the value that exists only because of you, because of the physician, your surgical skills, your bedside manner, your reputation. Your personal goodwill is technically separate property in many states, but proving how much of your practice value is actually your personal versus the enterprise requires a sophisticated financial analysis. And the reality is that most physicians don't know that difference. They walk into divorce with no documents. They have not talked to an expert. And that is a significant blind spot that I see when I'm working with physicians.
So if that goodwill, that reputation can be categorized as separate or joint property, does that mean that a judge can then assign value to a medical license or a reputation?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. The short answer, it depends. And I am not an attorney, but I use the word it depends because there is going to be real consequences regardless, but it literally depends not just on the state, but also honestly in your professionals, your experts, the evaluator that create the value that can convince a judge that they are right and that is or is not part of the marital estate. Some states have ruled specifically that a medical license is marital property and is subject to division. And particularly if that medical license was obtained during the marriage, right? You are in a very long-term marriage, 20, 25, 30 years, you work towards that medical license, right? So the logic that some of the judges use is that the non-practicing spouse, so the spouse that is not a doctor or a physician, contributed to this license basically, is whether through the financial support, domestic labor, supporting them at home, making their own career sacrifices, right? For example, moving, so med school, you can go to med school, and it should share in the future earning capacity that it represents. This has a real financial impact on both spouses, not just the physician. But here is what is more important than the legal theory. So even in states that do not explicitly value a medical license, the courts would absolutely consider your earning capacity when calculating support obligations. So I have seen, for example, judges will impute income to physicians based on what they could earn. not that what they're actually earning, that's what makes it very dangerous, right? Let's pretend that you own your practice and you decided that you want to work 3 days a week because you are burnt out, maybe because this divorce process has gotten out to you and you need more time, or you simply reduce your hours so you can spend more time with your children. Well, a judge could very easily calculate your support based on your full-time practice anyway, not taking into consideration that you wanted to spend more time with family. For example, your reputation, your referral networks, your standing in the medical community, that drives an earning capacity. And while a judge cannot put a dollar figure on your reputation directly, they will consider that when assessing your ability to pay support. So it's not just about how we're going to value your practice, it's how is your income going to be, or your income calculations going to be affected when it comes to this. This is why I usually tell my clients when I work with physicians is you cannot wait until your divorce papers are filed to start thinking about how your practice will be valued. Because by then, the financial snapshot has already been taken, and you're literally playing defense almost because you do not take the precautions of protecting that practice ahead of time or your income or your earning capacity. Honestly, the time to document the separate property contributions you bill when you bill your practice, or the time to understand what portion of your practice value is personal, maybe it's enterprise goodwill, that the time to structure your practice in a way that protects it, it is way before anyone mentions the D word for divorce.
Wow. So then what is the risk of splitting up patient relationships or referral networks?
Well, this is one of those blind spots that keeps me at night sometimes for my physicians' clients because it is rarely addressed directly, but it can literally destroy a practice. So you cannot split a patient relationship like you split a stock portfolio or an investment account or a retirement account, right? You cannot give half of your referral network to your spouse in a settlement. But it could potentially happen. Let's say your practice is valued as a community asset and your spouse is awarded a portion of that value. You may be forced to take on debt or liquidate other assets to buy them out. So I have seen physicians that take on hundreds of thousands in loans to pay their spouse's share of practice value. And then they struggle to maintain the practice while servicing that debt, right? Or worse, I have seen physicians, doctors that feel pressure to sell or even sometimes merge their practice to generate the cash they need for this settlement. So what happens then? You literally lose control over your patient's relationship that you spend so many decades building, right? And then the other scenario is that I've seen played out a lot is in very complex and aggressive divorces, especially when one spouse had connections within the medical community. There is a risk that their professional relationships become collateral damage. And what I mean by that is like, for example, I actually did work with a physician whose spouse was well connected in the local medical community through volunteer work, right? The spouse was not a physician, but she did a lot of volunteer work. During the divorce, that spouse made a lot of comments to mutual contacts that were not legally actionable, basically, like they were not true, but it affected the referral partners. So the physician's practice revenue dropped by 30% over 18 months. It wasn't because there was a decrease in quality. It wasn't because the physician was not doing the work the way they have been doing it or caring for their patients, but it was because the referrals dried up. So it's very important that you understand that this process is going to affect your practice because you're a very public person. Because you have a practice, you are in the community. Most of your clients your patients come from other referrals, from other patients, from other doctors. So the best protection for your referral network is a divorce process that doesn't become public warfare. And sometimes the smartest financial decisions is settling for a little less that you may get in court potentially because you are protecting the professional relationships that actually generate your income. And let's be honest, this particular situation where the spouse was bad-mouthing their spouse in the community and reduce his earning capacity, it affected that spouse too because it affected the income that was being generated, which in return affected the value of the practice and the possibility of paying support. So it wasn't a good idea, but just because it wasn't a good idea, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen, right? Because we're dealing with emotions here, and individuals tend to react more on the emotional side than the practical side and the strategic side, right? So I feel like if you are the physician and you're going through this, there has to be a certain levels of protection. First of all, we're going to document and protect the goodwill that is personally you, right? So we need the right experts. And that's a lot of the work I do. I review medical valuations of medical practice because I can find those gaps or their blind spots that the evaluator is using a certain way of doing this valuation, but I can contribute and I can either challenge the other sides or I can help my clients experts, right? The other thing is you have to structure the buyout in a way that doesn't really damage your ability to maintain the practice. So you have to negotiate a settlement where the payments are structured over time rather than lump sums, because you also want to maintain the cash flow and the operations of the practice, right? It's literally like a circle. Like if your practice is affected, if you can keep up with generating the money in the practice and maintaining the practice, you can make the payments for support or for a settlement agreement, right? And then the last one, which I think is not really dependable on the one person. It really depends on both parties, but you have to try to keep the process as private, as professional as possible. I believe the physician's reputation is worth more than the winning every argument. I have clients, like I said, that were physicians that accepted something a little bit less favorable financially for them, but the exchange was a confidentiality agreement because you want to protect your professional standing within the community, which is very, very important in this case for physicians, basically.
So it sounds like once you're in that position of desperation, things can go sideways really fast.
Very quickly. Yes. And remember, you don't have control over somebody else. You can only control yourself. So again, if you have a spouse that is involved in the community and they're going to be sharing information, whether it's true or not, it will have a ripple effect and it's going to affect your practice and your reputation, which as a physician, your reputation is very important. Like almost any professional, right? My reputation is very important as well. But when it comes to physician, people need to trust the physician you go see, right? We want to trust our doctors. So if there's some words going out there about maybe your values or your ethics, people are going to challenge that and it's going to affect your practice because it's going to affect your reputation.
So if we could turn back the clock, or maybe somebody is in attendance who is, about to get married, has their private practice or is in the process of building their private practice, or they're already married, but that topic or idea of separation has come about. How can a physician protect their practice now, whether it's before marriage or during their marriage?
Okay. I love this question. And the best time to protect your practice, if you're not married, if you're about to get married, the best time to protect your practice is before you get married. Okay, that's not romantic. I know it's not love, but it's just where strategic thinking is going to save you money down the road, right? So if you build your practice before your marriage, you have to document everything as you move forward within this marriage, right? The one thing I will suggest is get a formal evaluation of your practice worth before you get married. So then you have a real document that tells you this practice has this value right before we got married, because that's going to give you a very good starting point most people don't have, right? So it gives you an advantage because it's going to give you the baseline. Now, if you're building your practice during the marriage, but let's say you're using separate funds, right? Maybe you have an inheritance or premarital savings, or your parents gave you some gifts for you to open this practice, baby. You have to trace these contributions and you have to keep records, okay? So a lot of states allow for you to keep track of these contributions and keep them separate. So even if you're married 15, 20, 25 years, you can go back and say, I made this contribution. So that creates a separation in what is called the marital estate, right? I will consider a premarital agreement. I think that if you can talk to an attorney, have a premarital agreement, prenuptial agreement, It's going to address how the practice is treated during the divorce, right? So it can specifically say whether the practice is going to increase in value during the marriage, whether it will be separate or not, whether it will be marital property, or how we're going to value goodwill. For example, taking in consideration that the practice, a lot of the value of the practice is within the physician. Well, how do we want to address this if we ever split? Again, it's not romantic, but it's just being strategic to protect your future and your spouse's future too. Because if you have a baseline of how everything is going to be done, you don't have to worry. Nobody has to worry. And you're not going to have to spend thousands of dollars trying to figure out how to do this. So that would be my recommendation if you're not married yet. Okay? Now, while you're married, if you're already married, it's too late for you, but we can protect your practice anyway. So what I will say is that in this case, it will be a little bit more sophisticated, right? I will say, let's keep clean financial records. This is not just about medical practices, by the way. This is my advice. I work with a lot of business owners, and you have got to keep the records separately. We have personal finances, we have practice finances, business finances. Do not mix those funds. Do not use your practice accounts for personal expenses. Every time you blur the line and you use your practice credit card to do something, to pay some personal expenses or your mortgage or something like that, you're creating a problem. You're literally are creating an argument or the ability for someone to argue whether an asset or its income stream or they're separate property or this is a community property. Okay, so keeping financial records. So you can start that tomorrow. You can start separating. A lot of people I know that use their practices, their businesses as just paying everything through the business. You can start that tomorrow. You can change that. The second, just keep documenting the separate property contributions. Whether you're in a state that I will accept that or not, it doesn't matter. You keep record, and then when you come to the table, you're making it easier for everyone to figure out whether it's going to be separate or not, and why it will and it would not. Because again, you have to prove everything, right? So let's just keep track of those separate resources or sources of money. You can actually do a post-nuptial agreement too. So they're a little bit more complex than prenuptial agreements because you need to go kind of back and have like a history of what is happening and it may create a little bit of conflict as to how we're going to divide now things that we've been married for 5-10 years. However, it can be done. And it will actually clarify how the practice will be handled when it comes to a divorce, if it comes to that. Honestly, I have physicians that I have used this prenuptial agreement to convert something that could have been a problem or a conflict if they went through a divorce, or create a valuation so they didn't have to argue again about a value, and both spouses accepted and they signed, so they didn't have to argue about that. And the last one, I will get a valuation of your practice every few years. And I know that there's a cost involved. However, this has two purposes. It gives you a realistic understanding of where you built, where you are, like what exactly is that you're building? Is it growing? Is not growing? So it helps you from the financial point of running a business, but also creates a tracing history, right, of how much your value and your practice was increasing or decreasing within the years as you were married, which is going to be great when you have to do two valuations and there's big difference between the experts. Well, that helps you to figure it out. During the divorce, well, now that the divorce is on the table, the strategy is completely different, and we have to go to damage control and strategic thinking. We will have to get a financial expert right away, which is something that can understand a practice valuation and how to do a physician valuation and can understand the difference between enterprise and personal goodwill, right? Because we don't want your spouse expert to be the one that sets the narrative about your practice and your worth. You have to actually document your working conditions and income variability. So if your income depends on you taking a call, seeing a lot of patients, for example, or doing certain procedures, right, that are physically demanding, for example, well, the courts need to understand how you work. It's not the same being a surgeon or a heart surgeon or anesthesiologist, or if you do a cosmetology surgery or if you are a general practitioner, right? Your practice will actually dictate how much can you actually work in this practice, depending on what's required of you as a person. That is important as well. And then the other part is something that I do with my client is you have to be creative about your settlement structures. You have got to protect the practice, the operation of the practice. If you negotiate an agreement where the practice was not divided, but the physician has to pay high support payments at other time, or has to give other marital assets in order to counter the value of the practice, you have got to be very careful, because you need to be able to still run this practice as a business as you're going through this process. And you got to protect your network. You have to keep this process professional and as confidential as you can. Every email, every public argument, everything is a threat to damaging your professional reputation, which is what is very important to understand how difficult it can be, because you will not be able potentially to react the way that you want to react, because you want to make sure that you protect your livelihood, which is your practice, which is entangled to your reputation.
Gabriela, final question before we break for the session. What's one thing that every provider should do today to secure their financial future?
Okay, the one thing that I think it will change everything, like you can do today, no matter where you are, get a valuation of your practice. Go and have a evaluator, do a good research and talk to a evaluator and talk to a professional that understands medical practices, if possible, your type of medical practice, because there's a lot of distinctions, and the difference between the enterprise goodwill and your personal goodwill. So I think that that's the best one that you can do no matter where you are, because it's going to help you. If you're not during through a divorce, it's going to give you a lot of information about what you built and what you may be losing. That's key. So if a divorce ever happens, you have established the baseline, right? You're not starting from zero. You have something to go from. If you think you're heading through a divorce, this valuation is going to be your defense against maybe inflated claims, or about what your practice is worth, or what your spouse is saying, or their attorney or their experts are saying. So I think that will be a great starting point in this case. And then if you are in divorce, this is not optional, it's essential. And a lot of the times, my clients don't want to spend the money. They think it will not be worth it. But I'm telling you, when you have a difference between, they could be 1 million, 1.5 million, is significant. You have to protect your practice. You had to protect your livelihood. You had to protect what you have built. And then the second one, I think it will be, how is your practice structure? Are you the only practitioner and you're the only owner? Do you own with some other doctors? How is that going to affect what your operating agreements say? Because honestly, it really depends how the practice is set up as a business, how you have to protect it going on, and whether you have. I have physicians that have a clause in their operating agreements that says that if one of them goes through a divorce, they immediately get sold their portion of the practice, and they just don't have a practice anymore. Because you got to understand, when you become through a divorce, everything is public, right? Your partner's spouse is going to have a right to see all your books, literally. And so a lot of the ones that are doing it correctly, if they have other physicians partners, they are like, okay, if anyone goes through a divorce, they immediately get bought out. The physician gets bought out, and that's it. Because you don't want a third party that is not part of your practice, right, to having all that access. So I think it's important to understand your structure, whether you're a solo practitioner, just a physician, or if you have other partners, because it's going to change how we protect your business. But basically, the bottom line for me is you had to think strategically about your financial vulnerability. I think it's happening. If divorce is imminent, a lot of your options are going to be out of the table if you don't prepare for this. Okay, so if physicians come through divorce with their practices intact, are the ones who thought all these moves ahead. They documented, they talked to the experts, they brought me ahead of time so we can clean the financial records. They understand what they're talking about when they talk about their practices, the worth of their practice, how is it structured, how it's supposed to be, if we have to divide or do a buyout, what are the options, right? What are your possibilities? If you think about all this ahead of time, you can save your practice. You 100% can save your practice, but you have to have strategy, basically. So honestly, if you want to protect your practice, the best time to do that was 5 years ago. And the second best time is today when you walk out of this room, because you cannot wait until the D word is brought up to the table, the dinner table, or you're served with papers. Because you can still protect it, but you're not going to be able to have as many options as you could have if you protected this ahead of time or when you thought that maybe this was happening. Again, I think defense is not really the best plan when it comes to divorce, and it's always more expensive. If you prepare before, it's going to be more savable with more options, and it also is going to be less cost efficient.
Gabriela, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. I'm looking forward to our next session on the Ever After Wealth Divorce Strategy Framework.
I can't wait. Well, thank you for listening. And here's what I want you to take away from this conversation. Your medical practice is likely the most valuable asset you will ever build. It represents decades of training, millions of dollars of investment, and countless hours of serving patients. But in divorce, that practice becomes a financial chess piece. And if you have not thought strategically about how to protect it, you are at a significant disadvantage. The good news is that with the right strategy and documentation, you can protect what you have built. But that strategy has to start before anyone even mentions the word divorce. If you're a physician, a dentist, or a medical provider with a private practice, I encourage you to call me. Check my website, www.everafterwealth.com. There's a page specifically for physicians. You can schedule a call. We can talk about how can you protect your practice. We can look at your blind spots before nobody is looking, so you are ready for this and you protect your practice and your work. And next time, always remember, other professionals react to divorce, but divorce demands strategy. And I want to make sure you have yours before you need it. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you're going through a separation or divorce, please contact me through my website at everafterwealth.com. I would love to be a resource and partner as you navigate this season and prepare for your financial future. I'll see you in the next episode.